On the screen are the fateful dives of the pilots of the Empire of the Rising Sun warriors. Prepared to turn their own bodies into weapons during the darkest hours of Japan. Off the coast of the Philippine archipelago, the skies burn red with airstrikes, while the sea below churns and boils, as though it seeks to swallow everything upon it. The largest naval battle in military history unfolds with unrestrained ferocity. Its outcome will decide the fate of the entire Asia-Pacific region. Can the spirit of Bushido and the divine winds of the Kamikaze help Japan crush the enemy assault, as history once recorded? Or is this the tolling of the death knell for the combined fleet, the moment that marks the end of Imperial Japan's naval might in the Pacific War? In 1941, while the European battlefield was already in flames, Japan quietly opened another front in the Pacific. On December 7th of that year, a horrifying event shook the United States and the entire world. The Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, marking the beginning of its sweeping expansion across the Pacific region. Immediately afterward, they began their invasion of the Philippines, then still an American colony. The Philippines held a crucial intermediate position, controlling lines of movement between Japanese-occupied territories such as China, Taiwan, and Indochina. It was also rich in resources like oil, coal, and iron, and most importantly housed key U.S. military bases. Losing this archipelago became one of the most devastating defeats in American military history, with as many as 25,000 soldiers killed and 100,000 captured. Japan did not stop there. One by one, Southeast Asian nations Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, Indonesia, along with many vital island chains across the Pacific, such as Wake the Solomons and the Marshalls, fell into the hands of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Faced with this thunderous blow, the American giant awoke at once. Immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress, declared war on Japan, and officially brought the United States into the Second World War. With overwhelming economic, industrial, and military strength, the United States began launching operations to contain and ultimately defeat Japan. It started with the pivotal counteroffensive at Midway, where American forces brilliantly destroyed 4 aircraft carriers and roughly 250 aircraft of Japan's combined fleet, an irreparable blow to its naval aviation power. After Midway, the United States shifted from defense to offense, reclaiming island groups across the Pacific one by one. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted near the Mariana Islands. It became the largest carrier versus carrier confrontation in history, involving 24 aircraft carriers and roughly 350 planes. The Americans won a decisive victory. Their pilots shot down 600 Japanese aircraft while suffering losses barely 1/5 of that number. Meanwhile, Japan lost 3 more major carriers and, even more disastrous, virtually all of its remaining experienced pilots. From this point on, Japan could no longer mount any large-scale air offensive and was forced into a desperate defensive posture. Because the imbalance of power had become impossible to ignore, Japan understood that if the United States attacked either Taiwan or the Philippines, they would be forced to commit every remaining resource to defend those areas. By this time, Japan's raw materials and fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The resources transported from Southeast Asia were the lifeline of its industry. If either location fell, those supply routes would be severed, leaving modern aircraft and tens of thousands-ton warships to rust uselessly at their bases for lack of fuel. Thus, Japan devised the show plan, a series of responses depending on America's strategic intention. Meanwhile, the United States debated whether to strike Taiwan or the Philippines first. After careful consideration, General MacArthur and President Roosevelt decided to launch the campaign to retake the Philippines. The assault would be carried out by the two most powerful American fleets in the Pacific. The Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, included Task Force 38, the most formidable naval force in the world at the time, with 17 aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, and dozens of escorting destroyers. Supporting the Third Fleet was the Seventh Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, consisting of more than 700 vessels of all types, responsible for combat operations, transport minesweeping, and preparations for the massive amphibious landing. On October 20th, 1944, after intense air raids and naval bombardments, General MacArthur and 13,000 American troops landed on the eastern shores of Leyte with minimal resistance. But the Japanese were not caught off guard. They had already activated the Show 1 plan to counter the U.S. landing. At this time, the Japanese combined fleet was deployed across two main locations. The Northern Force, commanded by Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, was stationed in the waters off Taiwan and Japan. This formation possessed the only remaining operational aircraft carrier and would act as bait. Its mission was to lure the U.S. Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. The rest of the fleet was concentrated at Brunei, including the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi and Nagato, along with numerous cruisers and destroyer escorts. From there, they were divided into two striking forces. The Central Force under Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo would sail north into the Sibuyan Sea and then enter Leyte Gulf through the San Bernardino Strait. The Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohei and Nishimura Shoji would move southward, cross the Surigao Strait, and press into Leyte Gulf to join with the Central Force. Their intention was to engage the weaker U.S. 7th Fleet in a decisive battle. If victorious, Japan could threaten the American troops already ashore and potentially reverse the tide of the campaign. This plan, however, would soon face overwhelming obstacles from the Americans. At midnight on October 23rd, the Central Force was detected by two American submarines west of Palawan Island. Information about Japan's numbers, speed, and direction was immediately relayed to U.S. command. When dawn broke, a spread of precisely launched torpedoes heavily damaged one cruiser and sank two others, including Vice Admiral Kurita's flagship Atago. One of the two American submarines later ran aground while withdrawing and was destroyed by Japanese aircraft. The ambush inflicted serious losses and stripped Japan of the element of surprise. On the morning of October 24th, the U.S. Third Fleet suffered its first losses when a group of American carriers came under Japanese air attack east of Luzon. The strike was quickly repelled, but one lone dive bomber broke through the defensive screen and dropped a 220-kilogram bomb onto the light carrier USS Princeton. The explosion triggered a massive fire that raged until an even larger blast tore the ship apart. The tragedy also killed hundreds of sailors aboard the cruiser USS Birmingham, which had come alongside to assist in rescue efforts. While the Americans endured this blow, an even greater disaster struck Japan. After the submarine ambush, Kurita's Central Force pushed into the Sibuyan Sea, where the United States held absolute air superiority. Wave after wave of aircraft launched from carriers, USS Intrepid, USS Lexington, USS Essex, and others diving in for the attack. At 10:30 a.m. on October 24, 1944, the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, one of the 4 major engagements of Leyte Gulf, officially began. Helldivers loaded with bombs and TBF Avengers armed with torpedoes plunged through a dense storm of anti-aircraft fire, heading for the primary target, the super battleship Musashi, the twin sister of the Yamato. Despite being reinforced with over 130 25mm anti-aircraft guns, upgraded detection radar, fire control radar, and even employing the massive 460mm Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells, Musashi could not withstand the overwhelming assault. It held on stubbornly, but suffered severe damage, slowed, and gradually fell behind the formation. American aircraft continued their relentless attacks. By 3:15 p.m., the U.S. Navy launched its final killing blow. Musashi had taken at least 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedoes. At last it capsized and sank at 5:30 p.m., taking roughly 1,000 sailors with it. After the battle, the Central Force lost 1 additional cruiser, yet the remaining ships still retained enough strength to continue fighting. At 2:00 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Nishimura's squadron began entering the Surigao Strait, the site of the second major engagement of Leyte Gulf, and the final battle in history where battleships would face each other directly. His force consisted of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers. 25 nautical miles behind him was Vice Admiral Shima's group made up of 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Opposing them was America's 7th Fleet with an overwhelming lineup: 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 39 PT boats. Surigao Strait became the stage for a battle whose outcome would be completely one-sided. Even before the main engagement began, U.S. destroyers hiding in the darkness launched torpedoes that sank the battleship Fuso, along with 3 of Nishimura's destroyers. Despite the heavy losses, Nishimura pressed forward, only to sail directly into a wall of American battleships deployed across the strait waiting for him. With advanced fire control radar, the U.S. battleships opened fire from 20 kilometers away, well beyond Japan's effective range. Accurate salvos struck Nishimura's flagship Yamashiro, crippling it, before torpedoes delivered the final blow. The cruiser Mogami was severely damaged. Vice Admiral Shima arrived last. Seeing the hopeless situation, he had no choice but to withdraw. Surigao Strait was secured. The Americans had shattered one arm of the Japanese attack. At this point, anyone who assumed the battle was already decided would be gravely mistaken. And that mistake began with Admiral William Halsey himself. Upon receiving reconnaissance reports about Japan's northern force, he moved almost the entirety of the 3rd Fleet north to destroy Japan's last operational carrier. He even ignored orders to form Task Force 34. A powerful group of 6 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, to guard the San Bernardino Strait. As a result, the strait was left completely unprotected. At 3:00 a.m. on October 25th, Kurita's Central Force quietly slipped through San Bernardino Strait and headed south along the eastern coast of Samar Island. Despite earlier losses, his formation remained one of the most formidable fleets still afloat in the Pacific 4 battleships, including Yamato, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. With the U.S. 7th Fleet fully engaged at Surigao, American ground forces on Leyte suddenly found themselves exposed and dangerously vulnerable. Among all naval battles of World War II, few moments were as insane, desperate, and astonishingly heroic as what unfolded off Samar on the morning of October 25, 1944. It was a moment when the balance of power could not have been worse for the Americans. Taffy 3, a small task unit with 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, stood as the final wall between the approaching giants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Facing them was Kurita Takeo, commanding an overwhelming force of 4 battleships, including Yamato, the largest warship ever built, 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers. It was not a fair fight. It was a death sentence already signed. But war does not always follow what is reasonable. When Kurita unexpectedly stumbled upon Taffy 3 after emerging from San Bernardino Strait, he opened fire immediately. Towering columns of seawater erupted around the U.S. escort carriers, forcing them to flee at full speed, merely to cling to survival. But how long could they run? And where could they run to when behind them, an entire battlefield was rising out of the flames? In that moment, one man decided the fate of the battle, Ernest E. Evans, commander of the destroyer, USS Johnston. Without waiting for orders, he swung his ship, a small vessel with armor as thin as tin, and charged straight at the Japanese fleet. Attack, Evans commanded, and Johnston truly attacked, firing torpedoes, blasting its 5-inch guns at ships clad in armor many times thicker than its own. It was a near-suicidal act, yet astonishingly effective. Weak points appeared. Kumano was hit by a torpedo. Yamato was forced to turn away to avoid the assault, pushing her far from the center of the fight. Alone, Johnston had created the first crack. Taffy 3 seized the opportunity. The remaining destroyers wheeled around and counterattacked. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 dove again and again, bombing, strafing many, even launching without weapons, simply to harass the enemy. A hopeless fight transformed into a chaotic, bewildering storm. The Japanese fleet, despite its massive strength, began to lose tempo, lose formation, and finally, lose initiative altogether. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost Kumano, crippled, and 3 cruisers, while Yamato was isolated from the main fleet. The U.S. lost 3 destroyers, including USS Johnston and 1 escort carrier. But the impossible happened. Kurita ordered a retreat. He believed he had been fighting a far stronger force, an illusion created entirely by the sheer courage and ferocity of the smallest ships in the Pacific. The United States later awarded Ernest Evans the Medal of Honor, and history records that off Samar, the smallest ships in the Pacific stood against the strongest fleet Japan had left and forced it to turn back. One of the greatest moments of human courage ever witnessed at sea. After Kurita withdrew from Samar, a decision that erased Japan's only real chance to turn the tide, the battlefield at Leyte seemed to tilt decisively toward the United States. But Japan still held one final card, a desperate card. Because if naval guns could no longer stop the American advance, then the bodies of pilots would take their place. It was in this very moment that the darkest chapter of the Kamikaze tactic began. As the echoes of Samar faded into the waves, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro ordered the special attack units to launch from Luzon. These aircraft carried bombs, carried no hope of returning, and hurled themselves directly into American warships in Leyte Gulf and off the coast of Samar. USS St. Lo was struck and sank in a chain of violent explosions. Another escort carrier burned fiercely for hours. Shock rippled through the entire U.S. fleet. But despite the heavy damage inflicted, those first desperate suicide dives could not save the Philippines, nor could they save the Japanese Empire from the spiral of defeat closing in around it. The first kamikaze strikes had sown terror among American sailors, but they could not alter the tightening fate surrounding the Japanese Empire. And while those pilots plunged toward Leyte like desperate blades, a far greater tragedy was unfolding elsewhere in the Pacific. For the battle off Cape Engaño was not merely another clash, it was the final curtain falling on the era of Japanese aircraft carriers. While Taffy 3 was fighting for its life off Samar, Admiral William Halsey chose to pursue what he believed would be the decisive blow, Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo's Northern Force. Leading that formation was Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. To Halsey, destroying it meant extinguishing the Japanese dream of maritime empire once and for all. But the question was it the right choice? The balance of power was painfully clear. Ozawa had only one fleet carrier left, 3 light carriers, 2 hybrid carrier battleships, and a handful of cruisers and destroyers. More importantly, Japan possessed barely 100 aircraft, most flown by inexperienced pilots. In contrast, Halsey advanced with a Steel Storm, 5 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 41 destroyers, fielding a total of 600 1,000-ton aircraft ready to launch. At dawn on October 25th, Ozawa sent out 75 aircraft. But within minutes, the skies above Engaño belonged entirely to the Americans. From that moment, wave after wave of U.S. strike groups rained bombs and torpedoes onto the Japanese fleet struggling to hold the line. Zuikaku was hit repeatedly, listing heavily, before slipping beneath the waves, carrying with it the fading legacy of the carrier force that had once terrorized the Pacific in the early war. 2 light carriers were sunk, another carrier and a cruiser were left crippled. Only when the grim news from Samar reached him did Halsey realize he had left his flank exposed. He immediately turned back, but the need for several ships to break off and refuel allowed a few Japanese vessels to escape into the night. Even so, the outcome was unmistakable. The bait action at Cape Engaño became the graveyard of Japan's remaining carrier fleet, a tragic, thunderous finale to the era when they once ruled the skies over the Pacific. When Zuikaku slipped beneath the waters off Cape Engaño and Japan's final carrier force vanished in fire, the entire strategic landscape of the Pacific changed forever. This was no longer merely a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of an entire naval doctrine that Japan had spent decades building. And from that moment onward, the consequences of Leyte Gulf rippled outward like waves across the sea. After 2 days of brutal fighting, the show plan disintegrated completely. Japan not only failed to break the American beachhead at Leyte, but also lost most of its surface fleet, a strategic asset it would never again have the resources to rebuild. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies began tightening the noose around Japan island by island, chain by chain. They advanced, clearing the path for B-29 superfortresses to launch direct strikes on the Japanese homeland. And Leyte left behind an even more profound milestone. It proved that the age of the battleship had ended. From this point forward, the aircraft carrier became the heart of every modern fleet. More flexible, striking at greater ranges, and wielding power no naval gun could ever match. Leyte Gulf, therefore, was not just a victory. It was a turning point that reshaped naval warfare and the balance of power on the world's oceans, a legacy that endures to this very day.